So now's a good time to look at the mix bus. This is probably one of the most important factors in any mix because this is going to determine the overall sound of your mix that you then send to get mastered. Now remember, a mastering engineer is not a magician or a sorcerer. They are simply there to make your mix sound as good as it possibly can be. So in order to make that happen, you need to send them the best version of your mix that you can do. This is where the mix bus comes into play. Now we've already looked at EQing and we've looked at the top-down mix, so the majority, if not all of our processing has been done minimally on a group basis. Now when we look at this area, we can decide how we can sculpt the sound altogether. I've got a mix VCA here, so I can decide how much volume is going to our mix bus. But then I've also got my demo track here. So let's have a listen to the demo and then let's have a listen to ours. Okay, so what I'm finding is ours is a lot more open, it sounds a lot clearer, but there's a lot more mid-range push on our demo track. It sounds a lot thicker, and this is where our mix bus can come into play, dealing with the track as a whole. One of the first things we can do is look at EQing our mix. Now we can go in and look surgically and try and find pinpoint specific frequencies, or we can look at something on a more broader scale with a bit more color to it. Now in the mix bus, I'm going to be trying to treat this in getting some character and color into our otherwise possibly sterile mix. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at a EQ that has a bit of color. For this, I'm going to be using the IK Multimedia EQP1A. This is a Pultec emulation, and this is going to give us our desired color. Now this emulation plugin is very strange. The plugin itself, modeled off the Pultec, is quite a strange EQ to understand. It has 3 bands to it, but each of these bands work very differently. The low band has a boost and an attenuation. Now the boost is a low shelf, but the attenuation is a bell curve, which is attenuated, so a subtractive bell curve. However, the attenuation is higher up in the frequency spectrum at a multiple compared to the boosting. So for instance, if I'm at 60 Hertz and I boost this by 3 decibels, and then I attenuate by the same amount, I'm not attenuating 60, I'm attenuating closer to the higher frequencies or the low mid frequencies, which gives a very nice sweet sound to the ear. So where I'm adding quite low, I'm then taking away just above that in order to make the low sound a little bit thicker and a little bit more dominant. I'm going to leave these settings here, and then I'm going to come to the other 2 frequency settings. Now here we have a high frequency. Now this goes from 3K all the way up to 16K. This is a boosted bell curve. Here we have a bandwidth from very tight to very wide. I'm going to keep this towards the middle. I'm going to keep this at 10K, and I'm going to push this by 3 decibels again. Lastly, we have the attenuation. Now this is a shelf that is attenuated on the selection of either 5K, 10K, or 20K. I'm going to put this to 20, then take this down by a couple of decibels. We also then have an output here, which can then be used for gain compensation. So let's have a listen without our settings and then with. So around there kind of sounds nice. What we're doing is we're bringing out the boominess of that kick drum and the bass line, but without making them too muddy. We're adding a very wide Q at 3K, adding 5 on the boost, which was kind of filling out our mid-range that we were losing from our original demo. And then we've just done a little cut at 20K just to make it sound a little bit warmer. Now let's have a listen to this against our reference track. So we're getting a little bit closer to that warmth, but now we're evening out that low, mid and high frequency band range, and it's sounding still more open and a lot clearer. Really good for coming up to our next stage after the mix, which is mastering. Now after this EQ, we can look at something like compression. Now we haven't used compression here other than parallel compression in the whole of our mix, but using it on a mix bus is a really great way to hold everything together and glue things together, and especially with dance music or electronic music production where you have a dominant kick or a clap, those are normally the things that make that peak volume peak higher than you would expect it to. Using compression can bring those peaks of the kicks and the claps down towards the rest of the instrumentation, bring your peak volume down, but still manage to keep a nice vibey sound. One of the best compressors for this is a VCA style compressor. Now the VCA style compressor I'm going to be using here is the T-Rax bus compressor. This is a clone of the SSL 4000 bus compressor found in rack form and in SSL mixing desks. Now, when you're compressing a mix, it's a very good idea to make sure that you are quite conservative with your movements. So we don't want to make the mix sound crushed, but we do want to sound glued together. A good way to do this is to have a fairly mediocre attack, so not too fast, not too slow, but then a fairly fast release, because remember, the sound of a compressor is in its release. The longer the compressor holds onto is the longer you get the chance to hear what the compressor sounds like and its characteristics. The less we have of this is the less it holds onto the compressor, the less time we have to actually hear what's going on. This is what can give you that transparent style compression. We're going to keep it at a low ratio of 2:1, and then all we're going to do is adjust our threshold and our makeup in order to decide how much of the audio gets compressed. All we want to do, remember, is the kicks and the claps. So let's have a listen and let's have a tweak. So you can see there, all we're doing is we're getting maybe 2 or 3 decibels worth of compression, but the thickness of the overall sound becomes so much more apparent. It becomes warmer. This little grip function is great in this plugin, but it's mainly the compression that is pushing everything glued together. Now what's basically happening is the kicks and the claps are being brought down closer to the rest of the instrumentation, and then we are adding everything up relative by 2 decibels. So we're taking off around 2 or 3 dB, but then we're lifting the volume by 2 dB afterwards to make up the gain we've lost through our compression. So without this, it's just got so much more flavour and body. So let's go without the EQ or the compressor. So now we're getting a much thicker sound. Let's listen to the reference. So now we're getting that thickness. The only thing that sounds like it's lacking a little bit now are those brass parts. Now we can always go back to the brass sections here. now we're getting more of the characteristic of the demo sound, but we're getting the openness of our original mix just by adding a little bit of this compression here, pulling the threshold down so we're getting again a couple of decibels worth of gain reduction, and then add in the same amount back in with our makeup here. So now we're at the final stage of our mix. This is where we can decide, are we going to want to saturate this more? What is the overall goal for our mix? We've got it in the range that we want it to be in terms of the frequency content. We're holding it together with a little bit of glue. Everything's working kind of nicely. Do we want our mix to be at -6? Do we want it to be at -3? Do we know the mastering engineer? Most mastering engineers will ask you to deliver a WAV file at between -6 and -3, with -6 normally being the preferred method, but that is definitely down to a conversation between you and the mastering engineer. In order to get this bounce this way, we can take advantage of our main out, just to make sure that we don't get any more output than we need in terms of peak volume. In Pro Tools, it gives me the option here to right click and change the metering standard here. So what I can do is go to a Pro Tools Classic. Just like my stereo out fader here, and I can see that I'm getting to around about -3. What I'm going to do is pull up a metering plugin. Again, I'm going to use the IK Multimedia T-Rax metering. This is a great plugin just to give you all aspects of your mix's sound. You've got peak, RMS, LUFS, dynamic range. You've got a nice stereo width meter here with various visuals, and you also have a correlation meter. So let's have a look and see what we can get. So let's look at the metering here. What I'm going to do is open up this plugin and I'm going to pull down the mix bus volume to give us a true representation of what our output mix volume is. So let's have a look and let's have a see where we're at in terms of peak volume. So you can see here we're about -2. It peaks a little bit high towards the -1, but that's that initial crash. So what we're going to do is pull down our output mix bus by about 3 decibels and see where that gets us on our metering plugin. Maybe a touch more, maybe 4.5 dB here. So now this mix I'm kind of happy with, ready to go for mastering. It's going to get the beef that it needs from the mastering chain. It's nice and clear compared to the demo. If we look at the demo mix, we'll be able to see that it is a very thick mix with not that much dynamic to it. It looks well compressed and it does look like a very good mix. However, it is quite loud. What we're going to try and do is get a mix that is closer to a bit more dynamic in its range, to leave some of that compression if needed at the limiting stage in the mastering stage. But this is how I want that mix to sound. I want it to be a little bit louder than this, obviously through the mastering limiting, but that limiting hopefully is going to be quite transparent, so my mix sounds like this. The last thing we can look at is maybe some form of saturation here. Now we've already looked at saturation in the other tracks in terms of our mixes, but we can do some overall saturation here on our mix bus. This is going to kind of give that old analog sound or that warmer sound, and depending on the material that you are mixing, some of it could be quite sterile from soft synthesizers. This one sounds kind of nice, but it would sound nicer with a little bit more of an older edge to it because of the style of the music, that sort of old school American house sound. Another good saturation plugin from IK Multimedia is the Saturator X. Now this plugin has a few different variations in there, dealing with tape emulation, and also some sort of Master Plus 6, you've got steel and iron and so on, transformer styles. My preferred one here is the Master Plus 6. So let's have a listen without and then with. If you can hear what that saturation does to it, it might not be right for the track at the time, but it's always worth trying. This sounds really nice on this track. Now adding saturation to this also brings down those peaks and makes it sound a lot thicker, whilst bringing down that peak volume. As you can see, I've managed to add this plugin in and boost its output gain because of the saturation that I'm using. So let's have a listen to our mix without any processing whatsoever. Now we're getting closer to that demo track, but it's sounding a lot more polished. Each of the elements are a lot more spaced apart. It sounds a lot clearer. There's some depth and some 3D-ness to the track now. So now we're working to the demo. So we're making sure that the artist is happy, but we're also making sure that we're giving the best possible version of that mix to a master and engineer that has some space, has a fair bit of dynamic range, and enough headroom for them to really work that mix and get the best out of it with their mastering chain.